If you'd like to take your seat, thank you. Thank you for your patience. I'm just very grateful for John coming. How long's the trip been?
It should be 5 hours. It took 9.
It should be 5 hours. It took 9. But we're very grateful that you persevered, and we're looking forward. I don't think I'm actually going to say much because we want to hear you, and we look forward to what you've got to say. We're in your hands.
You had questions you want to ask?
Do you want to do the questions, or you?
It probably helped me.
It'll help you. Okay. All right. Come over here. Come over here. So I thought for questions, just very briefly, highlights about your family. A highlight.
Can't divide. 2, I think. One was marrying Julia, and the other I can't really divide, but it belongs up there. We have 4 children, and the arrival of each of them, I don't think I could break it up much more than that.
Good. And highlight about being a grazier?
It's actually being a farmer. I am both, but for me, nothing beats going into a really, really heavy wheat crop and seeing it pour into the bin on the header. And I love growing wheat because it's a staple that feeds people. And when I was young, it was worth a lot of money. These days, it depends a very great deal on what the Russians are doing and the Ukrainians are doing. And if they're selling onto global markets uninterruptedly, the wheat prices are quite ordinary. And when they stop, the wheat prices are much higher. But that has a terrible impact on the world's less fortunate. So it's not easy.
Okay.
But I love growing wheat.
And highlight as Deputy Prime Minister, a highlight?
Yeah.
Is that no comment?
The 2, as I thought about the question, I had advance notice, it's like Dorothy Dix's. The lightest moment actually happened in America. Way back in 1992, I was there for a month as a guest of the US government, and they gave me tickets to wherever I wanted to go to see whatever I wanted to do. So I did the sort of Washington, New York, Chicago business political end, and then wanted to see what was happening in rural America. So I flew into Kansas City, and those of you who know America will know that Kansas City's not in Kansas. It's in Missouri, or as they say, Missouri. I rented a car which had Missouri plates on it, went to a farm stay to the east. On the Sunday, drove back to stop with some friends in the state of Kansas, and I got lost on a tiny little back road. And I pulled up outside, totally frustrated like I was until a few minutes ago tonight. Lost. There was no Google Maps then, not like tonight. And I will record this against Google. They gave us the worst instructions I have ever had tonight. And my wife and I were saying, this is not the way to Leichhardt. And Google was saying, yes, it is. Trust us, go down this tunnel, and then they don't work in the tunnels. They're meant to. I'm a former transport minister. They should work in the tunnels. They're meant to. Anyway, I'm lost. I don't even get out of my little candy red Pontiac Pan Am, or whatever it was, Pontiac something or other, candy red, rent a car. Outside this little, we'd say weatherboard, they'd say clabbered, very decrepit farmhouse, timber frame thing. And out the front are standing a lady of about 40 who would have been very attractive with a good scrub, but she hadn't had one for a while. And she had a pet raccoon on her shoulders. I got to this point in the story telling George Bush, and he looked at me and he just said, as quick as flash, he said, "Did she have any teeth?" Anyway, there she is, and she's got a girl, a teenage girl beside her, and a boy about 12, and a younger girl. And I'm totally frustrated. I wind down the window, I unfold the map, and I say, "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm hopelessly lost. I can't find myself. Can you show me where I am on this map? And I might be able to get my bearings." Well, quick as a flash, the boy looked up at his mother and said, "Hey, Mama, this dude talks just like Crocodile Dundee." I can now date the audience. Well, Mum thought I might be about to produce a real knife, I think. So she grabs those kids like a hen gathering, pulls them back, the raccoon's off, and this look of deep concern on her face. She tugs them, holding on like iron around the front, the eyes looking down the shut line of the bonnet. She sees the number plates, Missouri. She just says, "All right, boy, there's nothing to worry about. He's only from Missouri." So I said, actually, your boy's right, I am from Australia. And she looked at me, she said, is that right? Did you drive? The other most momentous one, though, was 9/11 and the horrors of all of that, because John Howard was in America. He was very close to where the plane went into the Pentagon. If the curtains had been pulled back, the reporters behind him would have seen the plane going in. And that was a pretty serious moment. You suddenly realise you haven't got that option of jumping off the bridge, you're it. Because for a while we didn't know whether the PM was safe. The experts were locking down assets, as they called them, which meant things like the Prime Minister's family and mine, and anything they thought might be sensitive, because we fully expected further rolling attacks around the world. And I'm there sitting thinking, I've got to distill everything coming at me. Please, God, give me the strength not to make any mistakes.
And a highlight of your faith?
Highlight of my faith, unquestionably, I think, was the day when I actually realised it was true. I was a teenager. We had a chaplain who'd been banging on about a God who loves us, but then he introduced the idea that we could love him, and I thought that was nuts, because I'd always thought of him as big and impersonal, never doubted that he was there. So I went off to my cricket coach and commerce teacher. Didn't want to talk to the chaplain, that looked a bit too religious, but I knew that the commerce teacher had a faith, and I thought he knows what he's talking about, and I look back on it now and I realise he was all of 27, but he led me to faith, and that was, can't beat that.
Actually, my boys, when they saw the promo picture of you, they thought you looked like John Dutton from Yellowstone. But with much...
Who's he?
Don't worry about it. Much better ethics you've got, don't worry. Just the last thing I want to say before you start, John's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be opportunity for Q&A. And I was looking at his website, and one of the things that struck me is one of his mottos or dictum is that the people have the right to give their opinion, and that freedom of speech needs to be defended even if people disagree. And it's that gracious attitude that you displayed when you were in Parliament, and also today through your podcasts. You engage the Christian faith and the values, but you do it in a way that holds firm your conviction, but is gracious towards other people. And we love that about you, and we respect that about you. So we're really looking forward tonight. So about 40 minutes, and then John will do Q&A. And if you want to hang around, there's supper in our church cafe next door. Can we give John a clap? He's made a big effort.
You've always got to get the mic right. It's working down the back. It's a long way down there. So they're waving their hands. It's always just as well to check at the beginning. I remember once in the mighty town of Garrah. Anyone been to Garrah? A few people have? There you go. You grew up out there. Well, I was out there in 1983, it must have been, trying to advocate John Hewson's idea of a 15% GST. And it was just on dark. And in rolled the clouds and the thunder, and the storm broke, as only those western storms can. Little Tin Hall, if you've been to Garrah, you know it. And it just about drowned me out. And I realised the people down the back probably couldn't hear me, so I yelled out to a fellow I could just see through the gloom, "Hey, Jimmy, can you still hear me?" To which he replied, "I can, and in view of what you're saying, I'd like to change places with someone who can't." So no excuses if you can't hear me down the back, and change places. I'll know what you're about. The topic tonight, the only answer to cancel culture is courage culture, reflects the fact that we have abroad in all of the Western societies now that we are a part of, if you like, an extraordinary new tribalism emerging. It seems new. It seems avant-garde. It's described by the people who are essentially a big part of it as progressive, and by those who are critical of it often as woke, which is an African-American term, meaning that you are enlightened, you are awakened when you understand that the primary problem with the world is that whites are racist, only whites are racist, and all suffering can be traced to this problem, except those rare problems that can be traced to inequality between men and women. And it's given rise to the most extraordinary set of circumstances which actually are amazingly regressive, not progressive. They are taking us back to the default position for human beings and human societies, where essentially you feel you're on your own, that you're surrounded by enemies, you club together with as many like-minded as you can, and everybody else is your enemy. That stands in stark contradiction, I think, to the model in the West that has slowly evolved over the last, I would say, quite a few hundred years, frankly, whereby we have learnt to live with our greatest differences in an attitude not always of great celebration, but certainly of respect for one another. And I want to say to you that the problem is now so serious that I believe that we have arrived at a civilizational moment. We ought to be utterly realistic. There have been many civilizations before the one that we are part of, none as wealthy, perhaps as numerous in terms of money or whatever, but there have been many civilizations. Some of them wonderful, some of them quite terrifying. You wouldn't want to live in them, but they've all disappeared. They don't exist anymore. Even if the nations, Italy, for example, the Roman Empire, think of that, still exist, they are not global superpowers, the dominant civilization that they once were. A very simple way of considering this would be to say that every civilization has resulted from, shall we say, an engine which is fueled by some ongoing sense of commonality, of belonging to one another, and of a dream of a better society if we work together. Ultimately, the engine will splutter if it starts to run low on fuel. And there are really only three options at that point. You either refuel the motor, you find an alternative fuel, or you do what those other civilizations have done and fade out of existence. There are very few other options. In fact, so far as I can see, none. So here we have it. Every tenet, really, upon which Western civilization is built is essentially being at least challenged, and in many cases has now been overturned. And I think what I'd like to do is to ask you to think of the way in which, over time, the biblical idea of the worth and the dignity of every human being came to influence thinking. It's a very slow process, like water dripping on a stone that finally starts to shape it. I'm of Scottish extraction. Perhaps you could think of the Grand Canyon. Someone said to me the other day, if you want to know the story of the Grand Canyon, all you need to know is that a Scot dropped a sixpence down a crack in the ground and refused to stop digging until he'd found it. But the point is, of course, that, if you like, societies derive from great ideas. They're not an accident. They come about as the result of a lot of conflict, frankly. At best, it's just a conflict over ideas. At worst, there's been a lot of bloodshed. And so it's been with our culture. But the idea of the supremacy of the individual, because God says we all matter, is, in my view, foundational, though we have to rapidly move on and say that it can never be a selfish doctrine. The doctrine of the individual must not be used to justify selfishness. At its most basic, David, if I am to say that I am a unique image, person made in the image of God, I have to say, so are you. And so it was that in one of the most interesting things that I think our longest-serving Prime Minister, Bob Menzies, ever said, a man of very great intellect, I have to say, his writings are fascinating. If you haven't done so, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, seriously, grab a copy of the book that his daughter, who's still alive, Heather Henderson, put together, rather than authored, I suppose, edited would be the word, called Letters to My Daughter. But here is a superb mind who cares for principle, who cares for democracy, who cares for the Australian people, despite his critics saying he was more British than Australian. He deeply cared about this country, and he made a very interesting observation. I think it's worth repeating. Democracy is not so much a machine as a spirit, in which, regardless of our standing in our society, whether we're rich, whether we're poor, whether we're from Queensland or Sydney or whatever, all souls are equal in the eyes of heaven. That's true equality. And can I just segue there to be really clear about something? You asked about the most important point in my Christian faith. It was the point of my conversion. But one of the things I have slowly realised to a deeper and deeper level all the way through is that God has no distinction, makes no distinction at all. We hear a lot about racism today. We talk about cancel culture. The quickest way to get yourself cancelled today is to say something that activists can portray as racist. You've all seen it. You've all seen the attempts to destroy people or to marginalise them, to push them out of the debate. We know that it's sometimes so serious on social media that young people take their lives. That's the price of the new intolerance. But here is the point that I just wanted to make from a personal perspective. As a Christian, I accept that no matter my standing or lack of standing, no matter my wealth or lack of wealth, no matter the colour of my skin, no matter my gender, no matter, those things do not matter. In the eyes of heaven, my soul is of great worth, and every other soul around me is exactly the same. And I was struck reading through Job the other day. Job in his misery comments that all human beings begin the same way, formed by God in their mother's wombs, no exception. And then you think of that staggering statement in Galatians, for we are now all one in Christ. There is no Greek nor Gentile, Jew nor Gentile, no man nor woman, no slave nor free. All souls equal in the eyes of heaven. I think that that is the key, frankly, to creating a society where you can have human flourishing, the maximum degree of freedom, ordered freeing. It can't be licensed, as I'll try and illustrate in a moment, and that we ought not to lose sight of it. But we have. We've demonised it. One way in which that shows up is in the surveys that relate to trust. It's the same in all the Anglosphere. Why do I pick on the Anglosphere? Because we're part of it, and because essentially there are 5 nations which are basically derived from England, and the mother of the parliaments has been behind the way they've set up their governments, with a few ructions, particularly in America, as they rejected the British model and tried to find a different model called, the Western, or called, the Washington model. We call ours a Westminster, I suppose you'd say. But the mother of parliaments, England, has massively shaped, if you like, based on the idea of the worth of every individual, the American democratic experience, certainly the Australian, the New Zealand, and the Canadian. In some ways, we were the last to form our constitution. Here's an interesting little fact for you. Back when our forefathers were putting our constitution together, they bolted the whole thing together after they'd hammered it out and put it before the Australian people for them to pass judgment on. No details missing. They were all there, the whole thing. In contrast, say, to the Canadian constitution, where the people approved 70 principles and sent the politicians away to work it up, and the American one, where there are only a few principles established, and the American founding fathers were locked up behind doors in Philadelphia to map out their constitution. Ours, perhaps the most democratic of all, was decided on the most democratic way of all. The whole thing was put before the Australian people for their approval, and they approved it, and we became a nation. But what stands behind the centuries of thinking that stand behind our constitutional freedoms? How might they be understood? The quest to find a way in which all individuals can be respected, because that's what the Christian scriptures require of us. And so you can go right back, and obviously I can only sketch a few lines tonight, but you can go right back to the 14th century where theologians in Cambridge and in Oxford were doing some very deep thinking. There was one, and his name escapes me, I have to tell you, I've got to go back to the books and find his name, who wrote quite a treatise on true freedom being a situation where you knew that the Parliament, nor the king, nor any feudal overlord could be allowed to deprive you of the sanctity of your home, because your home should be, as we would say, your castle, where you are free to be who you choose to be, and free, within the limits of the law and so forth, to express your views and to interact with other people. We know how much we value our home. It's a sanctuary. But more than that, the Ten Commandments says twice that we should respect private property. We should respect that sanctity of the home. We should respect that if, as a farmer, I can produce some extra tons of wheat to export so that people are fed, and the more I grow and the more efficient I get, as the profits build, I can reinvest and produce more. That's how it's all worked. I'm not going to do that if I don't have a secure property right. If some feudal overlord's going to come and take everything and leave me half starving, unable to look after my kids, nothing to sell, so not only am I not prospering, I'm not even sure I've got enough for myself, I'm not going to be productive, am I? And that is one of the great freedoms. But the thinking evolved, and I could spend a lot of time trying to trace through what happened with the so-called, if you like, British Revolution, which kind of failed but got there in the end, the American Revolution, with its absolutely realistic assessment of human nature and the drawing up of constitutional arrangements which balance our inclination to do the wrong thing with our nobility. We're so good we had to give ourselves the vote, we're so bad we had to give ourselves the vote. You get the message? With what might be called the spirit of the French Revolution. Violent, nasty, utopian and unrealistic. And the French Revolution only lasted for 10 years, which was a great mercy because it was a horrendously brutal thing. But unfortunately there was a man called Karl Marx who noted it and approved of it and wrote it up, and it influenced his thinking. Karl Marx was buried in 1869, if my memory serves me correctly, on a drizzly day in London, Highgrove Cemetery, and there were 11 people at his funeral, and his ideas would have died with him, except that a man called Lenin came along, and you know the rest. The revolutions that gave rise, or that his thinking gave rise to, have visited untold misery on people, because in its essence, it's a philosophy that says, no, it's not the individual who has rights. All loyalty is owed to the party, and right and wrong will be determined not on principle, but on might and the need to preserve the party. I think we can see then that the model that we've slowly evolved in the West is far more attractive than the model that essentially derived, I think we can think of it this way, from the French Revolution model of utopian thinking. But what was it based on? Well, I've mentioned property rights. But in essence, what emerged was an understanding that just as the property rights imply that you own them, that there were certain other rights that you also had. And we talk most of all about freedom of speech, don't we? That's the one we talk about. But it's not the only one. You can't have freedom of speech if you don't have freedom of assembly or freedom not to assemble. It's said that discrimination is a bad word. Discrimination can be an evil thing, but it can be an entirely good thing. Can I tell you that every single politician I have ever met carefully discriminates when they choose their personal staff? Are you surprised by that? They do, and they should. The people I represented voted in to do a job, rightly expected me to put together an office of people who firstly were competent, but secondly shared my vision and wouldn't spend their entire time trying to undermine it. That's how it works. And when people think my vision's wrong, well, they peacefully vote me out. But in the meantime, they want me to be discerning, and sometimes that means being discriminatory, or discriminating, a better way to put it. And then there's the other great freedom. Very interestingly, in one of the conversations I did with a man called Frank Ferrudi. He said to me, now Frank Ferrudi is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Kent University. He's nearly 80, comes to Australia often. He's great fun to interview. He puts Michael Portillo to dead for things like pink trousers and blue sports coats. You know, cobalt blue sports coats. And anyway, he's a great character politically in many ways. We're on different sides of the fence. But I said to him, do you think freedom of speech, because a writer in The Australian had made this comment at the time, is our premier freedom because it's the one by which we defend all other freedoms? And he said, no, actually, I think chronologically at least, the first real freedom, in his view, is freedom of belief and conscience. If you like, religious freedom. And he said, whether people like it or not, before they woke up to how ungodly and unchristian it was, Christians were burning one another at the stake for having different theological views. And after a while, I think they realised this was grisly, horrible, stupid, because today's minority might be tomorrow's majority, and then the tables are turned and the other people are burnt, or you might end up burnt. But it's also profoundly unchristian, profoundly so. And he made the point that out of that, part of the genius in the West came to being a willingness to recognise that I may disagree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. Now, that's attributed to Voltaire. It wasn't Voltaire, it was one of his many, many biographers writing in the 1930s, but you will have heard it, and it's a good philosophy, isn't it? But it runs directly counter to cancel culture ideology, which says if you dare to disagree with me, I will do everything I can to rub you out. That's what it says. And where once we would have attached virtue to, if you like, to other people in terms of the Greco-Roman ideas of courage, justice, temperance and prudence, and the Christian ideas of love, faith and hope, we no longer attach a virtue to other people. We attach them to what they think and their belief system all too often. I think this is utterly appalling. So it might be that David and I had vehemently different views on climate change. I don't know whether we do or not, but just as an example. But in the old days, I would not have said he is a terrible person if we have a different view. I would have assessed his character against those. Is he a man of courage, of justice, of love, of faith, of temperance, of prudence? We think prudence is wowserism. It's not at all. Prudence means that you assemble all of the available information that you can, you draw together all of the information that you're missing, and you make the wisest decisions you can. Prudence is a great virtue. And that's the way I would have assessed you once, and I hope I still do, and I hope you do me, but it's not the way the world's doing it anymore. We are undermining these great concepts very badly. And so it is that speech in particular, we can see, is no longer being robustly defended. I have to say this bluntly, including on our campuses. Because although universities will say we guarantee free speech and we've stepped up and we've done this, that and the other, and although you've had reports into it saying there isn't a crisis, what's actually happening, of course, we know this from the research, people feel cowed. They're self-censoring. That's why there's not as much conflict as you might think. But I do these podcasts. You would be amazed at how often younger Australians come to me via e-meeting, I suppose you might say it, email, whatever, or personally, saying, I really agree with what you're saying, and I can't say what I honestly think at university. Sometimes I say it at school, in my workplace, what have you. A fellow said to me the other day, a 30-year-old, a brilliant engineer, he said, I actually happen to know a very great deal about the mechanics of renewable energy. And he said, in our workplace the other day, I was confronted with a situation where someone who was not an engineer said something that was just dead plain wrong from an engineering point of view. And he said, I suddenly realised I wasn't brave to say so because it wouldn't have been good for my career, even though it was true. Who benefits from that sort of approach? I said, what did you eventually decide to do? And he said, I decided to quietly but firmly put my case as respectfully as I could. I said, what was the price? I said, it became obvious that there were a lot of other people in the room who realised that it wasn't right either. And so the person who'd made the false statement backed off. This series of, if you like, undermining of our core freedoms, which are ours, by the way. It's really important to understand that, just as the idea of private property says, if it's yours, it's yours. It's not the government's. The Western tradition has evolved to the point where the same applies to freedom of assembly and to freedom of speech and to freedom of conscience and belief. I actually see them as a four-legged stool. Weaken one, you weaken them all. You really do. But the point I just wanted to make here, and it's a very important point, though in passing, is that we should always remember these things are not the gift of government in a democracy. It's the other way round. We gift to the government only such of our freedoms as we need for the common good, what side of the road you should drive on when the duck shooting begins or ends, and for, if you like, security against those who would do the wrong thing. But we should never surrender the notion that our freedoms are not the gift of government. It's a really important principle, as I see it, if we are to maintain true freedom. One of the really interesting things, and it's troubling, and I don't fully understand it yet, has been the decline in support for free speech. You would think in an age when minority groups everywhere are clamouring to be heard, they would be the first people to defend free speech. Because whilst you will often hear people who call themselves progressive saying, oh no, defending free speech is just for the powerful elites. They do that so that they can rule over us. The reverse is true. The reverse is true. Stop and think about how the minority in America, the black community, particularly in the civil rights movement, got heard. They were a minority. Much as it was loathed, for all of the playing up of the FBI and so forth, Martin Luther King and his friends, as a minority, were able to use free speech to mount powerful arguments. We should defend free speech in the interests not of the majority, but of the minority. And I say that even as somebody who's worried that in some ways, we used to talk about the, if you like, the tyranny of the majority. We now sometimes see the tyranny of the minority, where we are expected not just to accept and tolerate things that we might have once been worried about, but to actually embrace them and celebrate them now and never to raise questions. So you can have a reverse tyranny. But the point that I wanted to make about free speech that I don't fully understand and I want to unpack with you is that some of the people, one in particular of those that I've interviewed in recent times in my podcast, say that you can actually isolate the year in America when majority support for free speech switched to minority support. And it was 2014. How on earth could you isolate a year? Well, research is very sophisticated, and the answer is almost certainly tied up with social media. Social media reached a point where cancel culture meant that young people reached the point where they became so afraid of others abusing the right to free speech. Because like all freedoms, it must be used responsibly. Once it becomes license, freedom becomes the enemy of freedom. You see what I'm saying? And so I think young people, understandably, I get this, came to the point where they said, I've seen some of my friends reduced to total wrecks, rejected, hung out to dry, even been removed from university courses. In some cases, taken their own lives because of the way social media has allowed them to be cancelled. We are finding a new way to burn people at the stake. That's what we're doing. Look at J.K. Rowling, who's had the courage to take a position that even the actors that she made multi-millionaires come out and say, you're wrong, rather than a respectful discourse with her about something that most ordinary people, I can assure you from the surveys, we know this, including in this state, think that J.K. Rowling has a fairly legitimate line of arguing. It is a disgraceful thing that she should have been subjected to the treatment that she is. And many people would have wilted. They'd have been silenced, they'd have self-censored, or got involved into the debate and been so hurt they were effectively cancelled, sidelined, they're destroyed, their careers over, and in some very tragic cases, their lives over. So what is needed in the face of this drift, when we're so comfortable in Australia that it really is easier to turn over and go back to sleep when you don't want to get out of bed in the morning, and it's so easy to say, well, somebody else can worry about this. I think every one of us needs to challenge ourselves with a great reality. The vast majority of us have now become distrustful and cynical of public life. You don't have to confirm whether that's true or not. I can look up the Australian National University's data. It shows it. It tracks it. We've lost faith in one another. We've lost faith in politicians. It's worse than that. We've lost faith in the institutions that they serve in, whether it's the parliaments, whether it's the courts, the police force, the church. We've lost faith in those. We don't trust them anymore, even when we should trust them. You say, oh, no, get with the zeitgeist. They're all against us. Worse than that, we've come to distrust the ideas, the beliefs, the values that built those institutions, those guardians of our freedoms and our democracy and our legal system. Our young people have essentially not been taught their history. If they have, it's been taught very badly, or it's been taught in revisionist ways. The Welsh government has just decided in the last few days that it will be legal to remove all and any statues that people find offensive if they are white and male. Well, and the reason given, and I quote unquote, is so that history matches the modern narrative. Well, that means that it's not necessarily history. How can you not learn from history? If you take the simple issue of the desire to pull down Rhodes's statue in Oxford, I like Matthew Parris. He's a commentator in England. He said, no, leave it there and put a statue of the King of the Zulus on the other side and tell both sides. And guess what? You'll find that both did noble things and both did terrible things. Hello? Jonathan Haidt, again, not someone I'm politically aligned with, but a man I have a huge respect and affection for, has written a marvellous book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And he says often, and this is true, we should acknowledge this, with the best intentions in the world, we are teaching our children three fatal things. Firstly, always trust your feelings. Well, as Thomas Sowell said, that famous black academic American, brilliant man now in his 90s, the problem is not that little Johnny can't think. He can think. The problem is not that little Johnny can't feel. He can feel. The problem is we've taught little Johnny to think that feeling is thinking. And so now we're in danger of emoting everything. We don't have a real debate about everything. We say, get with the vibe. Well, just as the kid wandering down to the river in the Northern Territory saying it's a hot day, I know I'll feel a lot better if I have a swim. I don't need to take any notice of that sign up there that says there are crocodiles in here. It's not always wise not to check your feelings with your head, is it? But this is the point that Haidt makes in that book he co-authored, Coddling of the American Mind. I recommend it. So the next great mistake we're making is that we are teaching our children that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. That's what we're doing. We try and snowplow every problem out of our children's lives instead of helping them to learn through it. And he illustrates it in a really interesting point. He takes a plastic cup, he drops it on the floor, he picks it up and says, that's resilience, it's recovered its shape. Isn't that good? And then he'll say, that's not enough. You want the cup to come back stronger. And he calls it anti-fragility. By trying to pretend we can solve every problem for our children, we're actually stripping them of imagination, of hope, of courage, of the opportunity to be heroes. We try to do it all for themselves. I don't know whether any of you are teachers. I have 3 teachers, 2 of my daughters and my son-in-law. They say one of the terrible problems that puts them off teaching now is that if a kid does something wrong, if they try to do something about it, the parents come in and immediately take the child's side against the teacher in the school. In my day, that didn't happen. There'd have been once my father did take my school teacher on. Once. Every other time, it was the other way round. And the one time, I have to say, the teacher graciously said, yeah, I got that wrong, and reversed the decision that he'd made. But you know the story. You know what I'm driving at. And the third thing that we do with our children is probably the most fatal of all. We raise them up to believe that life is a battle between good people and bad people. That is the absolute lie at the heart of identity politics, of tribalism, that you're a bad person because you disagree with me, you have a different worldview. That is the denial of the genius of our culture, living together with our differences, even our greatest differences. And as the famous Solzhenitsyn had it, if only it was so simple to get rid of evil. There are evil problems, so we'll obliterate the evil people and there will be no more evil. Doesn't work like that, does it? Many regimes have tried that and ended up with greater evil than ever, because the dividing line between good and evil crosses every human heart. What to do? What to do? This is the great age of disengagement. Lord Sumption, the former Supreme Court judge in England, and about this time last year, in one of the podcasts I did with him, he said that for many decades, until quite recently, the British Labour Party had 1.1 million volunteer members and the British Conservatives 1.9, total of 3 million British people who belong to the political party of their choice. So today, the Royal Society of Birdwatchers in Britain has more members than all the political parties combined. People are disengaged. Everywhere I go, and I do still move around quite a bit, I am staggered by the people who say, we can't get good people to step up for anything. We can't find the right people to come onto our school boards. We're probably all terrified of how difficult that is now. Companies tell me it's really hard to get the variety and quality of people that they need because people are so frightened of the trouble you can get into now. It goes on and on and on. We need to be engaged. We've got to turn up. We need then an infusion of new citizenship. And I think I'll finish on this note and then take questions. That is where, as a believer, I think we are desperately needed. The world doesn't particularly want us at the moment. It's very obvious it's turning against us. If you don't think there's religious persecution, just have a look at the Human Rights Law Alliance's website and just see how frivolous and vexatious and obviously activist-driven some of the attacks on individuals, on schools and on charities actually are. And this is a really distressing thing to me because it attacks again the idea of freedom. You've now got the Law Reform Society has been asked by the government to have a look at staffing in schools. They're essentially wanting to strip from independent schools, which educate about over a third of our children. Parents are voting with their feet, many of them. That's choice. That's freedom for a particular educational environment for their children. And the state, if I can use that term loosely, which doesn't care what parents think. Don't miss that point. It doesn't care what parents think or want. The state is intent upon trying to push people into its mould, stripping away individuality, stripping away contestability of ideas. We need to be courageous. We need to be in the public square. We need, at all times, with respect and with decency, but with courage and resolution and wisdom, be challenging bad thinking, challenging ideas that reduce the opportunity for our fellow human beings to live in harmony and to flourish personally. These are very serious matters indeed. And I think we need, and I'll finish on this note, to take not only the first commandment seriously, but the second, to love our neighbours as ourselves. Because that is not what is happening now. We've set up a system of human rights architecture where we compete with our fellow Australians for our rights. Unless you're a Christian, in which case, despite the fact that then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said that religious freedom was even more important to him than same-sex marriage, we still don't have any protection worth a credible examination beside the protections that are now afforded to every other subgroup in the country. Even if you are not a Christian, and I've heard atheists say this is a bad thing. We need people to be able to be active in the public square. We need a public square that accommodates everyone. We either have a naked public square where no dissent is allowed, or we have one where only one set of values is allowed, or we have a mixed public square where people, on the basis that they respect one another, are free to interchange, free to contest ideas, free to put their faith, free to put their non-faith. And I think that needs the active engagement of good Australians everywhere, which is why, despite it being, I said to my wife, I think the worst trip we've ever had, I did want to be with you tonight. Let me just finish by saying what happened. New South Wales roads, country roads, are very badly damaged by the floods over the last couple of years. The backlog's enormous. The cost to repair them is $2.3 billion estimated. Local councils don't have that money, so there are broken roads everywhere. And we set out from home this morning with a smashed spare tyre in our car, smashed another one on the way to town, no spare tyre in town. We had to limp, the car's on run-flat tyres, so if you drive slowly, you can actually drive for 80 kilometres. We just got to Tamworth and the tyre fell to bits, and they were able to refit it. We'd lost 2 hours, then we got to Singleton, where there'd been an accident, and I was texting David saying we're only going to be 2 or 3 minutes late. Singleton put us 15 minutes behind, and we caught up 10 of that, and then we hit your beloved city, and I love it too. But those tunnels are something else. I mean, if you know where you're going, they're fine, but if you're relying on Google, all I can say is don't. Unbelievable, because we ended up at the airport. I apologise for that. It's been great being with you. Happy to take some questions. And please, if there's one thing I miss from Parliament, it's a good stoush, so bring it on if you want to disagree.
Thank you for a terrific speech. I just wanted to question your view that you're surprised that minority groups don't support free speech more avidly than they do. And I wonder if that isn't mistaking the elites of minority groups, those people who style themselves as the spokespeople of minority groups rather than minority groups. I mean, the Conservative Party in the UK, for example, is very highly represented by minority groups in their parliament, and they support the kind of values that you're portraying. So I think perhaps sometimes we tend to mistake the vocal few for their views about minority groups and believe that they represent them all.
I think that if people heard that, the thrust of the question was that, David, you probably caught it better than me. The thrust of the question was that it's very easy to misapportion blame for people who are not defending free speech. And often it's elites.
It's elites of the minority groups
who are failing to defend free speech.
They're the loudest voices, if I'm hearing you
I think
correctly.
that's absolutely right.
They're the loudest voices, is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, and I'll work it into my thinking because it is right. And I am frankly often utterly appalled at people who really ought to understand the vital nature of free speech, who fail to defend it, who fail to even see its importance. In fact, a very senior member of my own party said in the Parliament one day, "Oh, this is all just a waste of time," and what have you. I was in the Coonabarabran sale yards. I don't know. That's where your butchers buy meat from us so they can sell it to you in Sydney. And I was amazed at the number of people who are saying, "He's wrong. I want to be able to have my say. I'm a farmer. I want to be able to. We're only 2% of the Australian population. I want to be able to speak out," and they got it. It was very interesting. So that's an example of somebody in a privileged position not defending free speech when the ordinary people that he represented, in fact, were very passionate about it. So I think there's a lot of truth in that. And that's the trouble. All I can do tonight is to make some broad lines, some broad sketches. But it's also true that a lot of very nasty activists do decry it as something that the privileged and the well-to-do and the comfortable and all the rest of it use to keep minorities in silence. And that is not true. I mean, it may be true. They may try and misuse free speech. That's the point about the loss of support for free speech. But philosophically, the reason it's important is for people who are in need, who are disadvantaged, who are locked out, that they can be heard, that they can get into the public square and be heard.
Good. Thank you.
Hi. You spoke quite a bit about the influence of the British government, and I'm just acutely aware of, obviously outside the BBC is the saying from George Orwell that if liberty means anything, it means the right to be heard, to say information that people don't like, basically. Yet the BBC is just silenced. Obviously Gary Lineker had to take a step back. So the minority there were heard. The people did uprise. There wasn't that cancel culture. People were brave enough to stand up. The fellow people on his programme stood down, said we're not doing. So I do think there is a change. I also think here in Australia, when we look at change, the voice to Parliament for the Aboriginal people is part of that change too, that we can't ignore.
I missed the particular English example. I would say that Brexit...
Gary Lineker, yeah, the soccer player, right? Yeah.
So Gary Lineker, for those who might not know, he spoke out about the British policy to stop the boats, and he was in support of people seeking and coming to seek refugee status in the UK, and saw them as very vulnerable people, and made a political statement as a tweet. And the BBC took him down. They stood him down, despite what they have outside of their premises, which says liberty is about the right to say what people may not want to hear. They actually stood him down, and then he produces a show on Saturday night. It's very popular. The other people on the show stood down, and the country stood up for him. Because they believed also they were speaking for the minority.
Okay, I've got to be honest and say that maybe it's where you are, and I had an immense difficulty actually picking up on that. So
it's saying Gary Lineker, if I'm hearing you correctly, Gary Lineker was saying oppose the sort of rhetoric of stopping the boats, and he was stood down by the BBC.
He worked for the BBC though, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And there was an uprising from ordinary people who protested. So T's comment is that there are ordinary people in some quarters are being heard. It's not just the elites having the loudest voice. Is that a fair statement? And the voice to Parliament is part of it.
Is there anyone here who can actually tell me what the voice to Parliament is before we put it into the Constitution? What is it? Will it have the right to address the Parliament or the executive as well? Who will select who's on it? Should we not see whether it's different to the 7 voices we've already had, and whether it works before we ask the Australian people to put it into the Constitution? And there was a reason I put it before you, ladies and gentlemen, that I mentioned that in one of the greatest truly democratic acts of all time, the Australian Constitution in whole, with all of its detail, was put before the Australian people before they voted on it. And I just have to say to you, I have many Aboriginal friends who are deeply sceptical and many who are actually opposed. So I don't think you should assume that until the debate's been had properly, that it's necessarily a good thing, because I would say that the attempts to silence the debate by saying it would be rude not to vote for it, don't ask for the detail, is actually anti-democratic. So I must politely push back. I should acknowledge to you, I am a panel member with 5 Aboriginals of the Recognise a Better Way, where we say, yes, by all means recognise, but the 3 priorities should be, firstly, a recognition that does not end up in the courts and form another level of government. Secondly, how about some economic empowerment for the Aboriginal people who have now been given vast amounts of Australian land because the Australian people are generous and want to help. But there's a major bank in this country cheering on the yes vote, but it will not allow Aboriginal people to vote to borrow against their land in the way that you and I can to set up a business. So we're saying, how about an all-party committee to enable that to happen? And thirdly, and there's the most important point, in my view, I represented a vast number of Aboriginal people. They are micro-communities and they need to be listened from the ground up. And I would want to see evidence that the ground up is really going to be recognised, rather than another bureaucracy. Anyway, I'm sorry to sort of push back when I've got the microphone, but my first question stands: should you really support the voice until you know what it is? As responsible Australian citizens, I think we're entitled to know, and I would say the very example of anti-democratic behaviour is saying you must support this because it's the vibe. And if you're against it or you ask any questions, you're a racist. I'm not a racist. I believe racism is profoundly and deeply evil, like all hatred. It should have no place in our lives. But as somebody who represented a lot of Aboriginal people and saw ATSIC, that was the last voice we had, disbanded by both sides of Parliament because it became such a disgrace, I am not certain I can see that this is different enough to actually work, point one. Point two, I'm sorry, but the Australian people should not be asked to vote on it until they know what it is. I know nobody here's been able to tell me what it is. And, yeah.
Hi, John. Thanks very much for that. I just had a question about how you balance freedom of speech with the impact of the rise of misinformation in the public square, particularly when that misinformation can be dangerous for people.
Yeah, that's. I can't give you a neat answer to it because your point is entirely valid, isn't it? And I said to you, I really sympathise with young people who are saying appropriate speech might be better than free speech. I mean, what a nightmare. Who decides what's appropriate speech in the current climate? But I sympathise because of the way some of them have seen their friends and even themselves have been so badly belted up because people have used misinformation, untruths, dishonesty, emotion, not calm reason. They haven't entered into the debate. They have attacked the other person, sometimes mercilessly, and it brings everything into disrepute. And I don't have a neat answer. All I can do is to say that, you know, I'm getting a bit past it now. But while there's breath in my body, I want to say we've got to stand and defend these four great freedoms. The four great freedoms. Every Australian must own their right to freedom of belief and conscience, their right to free speech, their right to freedom of assembly. I mean, every time you have a dinner party, you're discriminating against all the people you didn't ask. This argument is carried to nuts extremes, and freedom of private property. And to point to people who have not understood how significant the erosion of these things has become and how it threatens our freedoms. See, can I tell you, Ronald Reagan was right. I'm from the government, the most dishonest statement in human history, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. Our culture is built around the idea that government will be downstream of the culture. The culture's downstream of the people's beliefs and values. That's how it works. And we're inverting it. We're allowing governments to say, you will be functions of us. We saw a fair bit of that during the COVID lockdowns, particularly in states other than this one. And it's astonishing now to travel because people right around the world say, what happened to you Aussies? You know, you allowed the police to drag off pregnant women over COVID. The other thing that I would say is that our system of government with its freedoms that belong to us will only work if we exercise them responsibly, which is at the heart of your question. Too many people are not. So in America, if you ask what's democracy, they'll quote Abraham Lincoln, government of the people, by the people, for the people. You've heard that? Abraham Lincoln was quoting a clergyman. And because he went to church, Abraham Lincoln was a believer. And the clergyman was quoting John Wycliffe from Oxford in the 14th century. And John Wycliffe was saying, that we need to be covenantal in our approach to government. We need to be responsible citizens, accepting our responsibilities, not just exercising our rights, working with our families, working with our neighbours to build a strong local community, a stronger, bigger community. Then we're in a position to diligently oversight government. Are we doing that now? We're cynical about government. Are we diligently oversighting it? Are we engaged? I know they're very complicated in the great debates. I actually believe that one of the most important moral issues that any government needs to handle is its economic management. And I meet Christians everywhere who say, oh, John, you want to talk about economics again? No, let's talk about schools, or let's talk about anything, or the environment, or whatever. Economic management is unbelievably important. One of the American founding forefathers made the observation there are two ways to lose your freedom. One is to surrender to a greater military force, and the other is to go bankrupt. And nations can go bankrupt just like individuals can. We need to be saying, I say that with some passion. In 1996, John Howard selected 5 of us. We were volunteered, in inverted commas. You, and you. I want the deficits ended, and then we're going to start repaying back the debt to end the intergenerational theft, because we're borrowing money that our kids are going to have to repay. And we did. We paid it all back, and we set up the Future Fund. It was horrible work. It got spat out in the streets until it started to produce results. Job numbers went up, prosperity went up, young people didn't go into an unemployment mess, and people then thought it was wonderful, and now they've lost their enthusiasm. No one talks about it, and we're racking up debts that are unconscionable. Many Western countries now are borrowing against not just their children, but the unborn. They're not living within their means. That's a highly moral business.
Just want to say freedom of speech is a great thing to pursue, but it's not an absolute, in the sense that I think the history of Western democracy, you had 2 big revivals in England and America, and it was said of England that it didn't go the way of France because of the Wesleyan Whitfield revival. But what happened in those societies is that you had values of love, concern for the marginalised, truth. They undergird freedom of speech. So you just don't want to pursue freedom of speech without the values that give it balance and wholeness.
David, I entirely agree, because I think the 4 freedoms only derive from a high view of our neighbour. That's where they come from. That's where they come from. The basis is, in Western culture, the idea that everyone's of equal value because the Almighty said so. And then that morphed into what was known as the Golden Rule. Do unto others, you'd have them do unto one another. Then it morphed into tolerance. Do you remember that phase? Now, tolerance is a virtue, but it's a lesser virtue. Oh, David, you're my neighbour, I'll tolerate you. It's not quite as strong as you're my neighbour, I will commit myself to loving you, respecting you, and doing the very best I can by you, even when we disagree, which is a stronger doctrine. And because it's not a great and powerful doctrine, it didn't last long. Tolerance is hardly ever spoken of now. We don't talk about toleration anymore. We talk about getting rid of people who have wrong-think. That's where we're rapidly going to. The very model of intolerance.
Yeah, g'day, John. Thanks. I enjoy your podcast, mate. I reckon it's unreal.
Oh, thank you.
I just wanted to say, like, obviously there's a rise of the alt-left into the public space now, and you brought up that there appears to be a distrust generally of political institutions. I was wondering if you think that the current Conservative Party is simply left, light, and not actually conservative. And then there's a bunch of people who feel there actually isn't a political party that speaks for them at all. So you got the alt-left, and then you got the left light. That's it.
It's a very interesting point. It's a very relevant point, and it's not just Australia. See, some people say there's no place for conservatism because there's nothing left to conserve. But I actually think you could say that there have been 3 major political strands in Australian political thinking. There's been your sort of typical sort of left-of-centre democratic socialists, what might be called the Christian Democrats in Europe. There's been classic capital L liberalism, and there's been conservatism, and John Howard famously said the Liberal Party is a home for the liberal and conservative tradition. But I would say that all three actually, in their own way, had some nobility underpinning them. I have a lot of respect for many of the old socialists. I might disagree with their models for fixing things, but not with their objectives. They were honourable. I remember one of the very early podcasts I did was with Bob Baldwin. Now, Bob's an atheist, and we disagree at that level, but Bob has deeply imbibed the Kool-Aid from Christianity, that every individual matters. So his model for the Labor Party, the traditional one, was the Labor Party is about lifting Australians who are marginalised or not getting a fair go and disadvantaged so that they're fully participating and respected members of the Australian family. That's noble. I agree with that. How could you argue with that? But he went on to say to me, but the model's broken. He said it, not me, because now it's about victimhood. You find somebody, whether they're a victim or not, and you say, you're a victim, you elevate them to a new aristocracy, you weaponise them, then you've got to keep them as victims. No, I didn't say that, but he did. And then you come to liberalism. Well, liberalism, amongst other things, I guess traditionally liberals believed in freedom for individuals and minimal government. The sort of idea that said a strong, vibrant citizenry, I sort of agree with this philosophy too, will neither want nor tolerate big, intrusive government. Now, unfortunately, they've drifted into libertarianism. Anything goes. And they all seem to advocate big government now, telling us we can do everything. The reverse of what I said. Government should be downstream of culture. And conservatives, well, some of the best thinkers, can I tell you this? I'll tell you a great problem. The facts are usually conservative. But nobody wants to listen anymore because we live in a remote. What do I mean by that? Things like the raw debt numbers that we're racking up. Conservatives worry about it, nobody else does. Well, almost nobody worries about it, so that tells you that conservatism is broken as well. Not completely, but I take your point. So they've all broken down, and we've all said, while ever we can keep borrowing to patch that need, to silence that squeaky wheel, to ease a bit of pain over there, kings since days of old have known that while ever you can borrow, you can pretend that everything's all right. But the debt levels we are now building up are unbelievable. America's debt levels are truly frightening. Ours are on the worst trajectory they've been on since the Second World War. As a certain government obliterated ours, the GFC started it again, but we've been on one of the fastest upward trajectories of any country, and we are going to pass on to our kids and our grandkids, and if we're not careful, the unborns, a debt load that they will really struggle to manage. Anyway, enough.
I've got 3 more questions, and I've got one over here, and then we're going to release people and supper if people want it, or home.
Thank you very much for tonight. I have my concern is how corporations work with, say, MSM to push forward a type of framework of thinking which is really a form of nudging and nudging people in society to think in a certain way.
Yep.
A classic example of that is the diversity, inclusive and equity framework. Just to give you an example, the other day I was just at the supermarket and I saw an advertising for, would you believe, just lollies. And what it said was, you know, and this is obviously targeting children or parents with children, and it said something like, be a good ally. Now, the word ally actually comes out of BLM. And BLM is very much a Marxist-based organisation. So it's, you know, just my concern is how these big corporations are able to advertise, then use MSM as a forum to continue with the kind of the framework, and we're talking about DIE and, you know, what's it called, racial injustice and all this sort of stuff. And finally, the idea of that becoming a form of social engineering.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes. Let me give you the good news. America gets there usually before Australia, and their corporates are starting to realise now because the research is telling them. that when they take a position, oh, I'm the boss of, Boeing, so you should listen to me, it's an absolute turn-off for people. And I'm going to be really blunt here. I don't mind if you tell your corporate leader next door tomorrow. If corporates don't get the message in Australia that trying to convince the people who don't like your business, because we're all a bit anti-business, by getting on board with woke social causes is about to backfire very badly. People don't like it. They see through it. They see that people are trying to use their wealth to influence others. And I think that's disgraceful. And I'll tell you what else I think is disgraceful. I can understand, I really can, why many young people are they're not investing. This is very interesting. The research is telling us that, the old saying, you probably heard it, if you're not a socialist at 18, you've got no head. And if you, no heart, and if you're still a socialist at 30, you've got no head. No, that's a bit risible, but you've probably heard the saying. You're more idealistic when you're young. When you start a family, buy a house, make a few investments, you're worried about your job, you become more cautious and less idealistic. It's not happening anymore, and one of the main reasons it's happening is that wages have been flatlining because of bad economic policy. You're not going to fix it by industrial relations reform, you're going to fix it with productivity improvements, but that's a hard message to sell, so no one does. And housing prices have gone through the roof. When I left school, an average Australian home cost 4 times average annual earnings. Today, it's 11 times, unless you're in Sydney or Melbourne, where it's 13. And I've got 4 kids, and one of them's a professional who said to me the other day, Dad, I just don't know how we're ever going to get ahead. And you will have heard your kids say that. Now, the problem is that they tend to look in the wrong places. So you'll see on voting day, they'll go for the people who promise them free this and free that and what have you, without realising that's just pouring petrol on the flame. It's just building up debts, which means the economy's slower, they have less jobs, their wages stay lower, and their taxes are suppressed. And this is what I mean about using this to feel rather than think. And I think both Paul Keating and Peter Costello deserved a lot of credit for the way they unpacked broad economics and what it meant for people, their jobs and their families, and buying a house and what have you. I think they were both very good at that. And I hope none of your neighbours are former treasurers, but I'm not sure we've had treasurers and prime ministers who have been so good at it since. And you need leaders to lead. That's what leaders do. They should lead the debate. A couple of questions have touched on that. Even when it's unpopular, they get out there and say what needs to be said. One other final comment that really troubles me. It really troubles me. I think I'm right in broadly saying, going back to the time I left school, a typical top executive of a listed 200 company might have earned 6 times what a worker in that business would have earned, but today it can be as high as 600 times. This is a disaster. This is crony capitalism. You see, then those same bosses say, oh, they don't like us much. We better go on board with the latest woke curve, the latest vibe, without realising, this is a point about the Americans, actually it's just going to drag them into further disrepute. What they ought to be doing is leading. They ought to be leading the debate about how we create wealth, about how we confront the challenges that are with us. How are we going to afford to triple our entire electricity generating capacity by 2030? Because that's what we have to do to get to 43%. Has anyone told you that, by the way? That's the engineer. You've got to triple what we have now, in total. Because you see, reliable, renewable energy has to be all sort of so interlinked with tens of billions of dollars of new power lines, so the wind's not blowing in I don't suppose you have any wind farms in Manly, do you? But if it's not blowing at Coolah, it might be blowing at Mount Isa, so you've got to bring the power down to Sydney from Mount Isa because you can't get it from Coolah, the infrastructure. But our total generating capacity built up, I suppose, since the 1920s, has to be tripled between now and 2030. Has anyone told you that? Isn't that a leader's job to say we want to get there, but you need to know how big it is? 22,000 solar panels a day. A day. And then there's Snowy 2, which was going to cost $2 billion. and be on stream by now, and we're now told it'll be 20 billion, and it won't come on stream until 2030. What's my point here? It's not to get into the arguments about the right and wrong of those policies, it's to say that you should be told as voters what these decisions mean. And do you know there's been no economic analysis released from the central agencies in Canberra about what 43% by 2030 means? My point is, information is gold, and voters are entitled to it, and leaders are failing us when they don't give us the whole picture.
Okay, two quick questions now, one here.
I don't really have a question, but more like a comment. So thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I think it's very inspiring for me. And I really like how you talk about we are to agree to disagree. I think it could, happen in many contexts, like across different denominations or social issues and conflicts. And what you talk the most is the best religion is the freedom of conscience. The best religious freedom is the freedom of conscience. Yeah, that's just a comment. So no question about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I absolutely believe it's your most basic right. Your right to believe and act in accordance with that belief in freedom without fear, provided only that you do not impinge on other people's freedom of conscience and belief.
There you go.
Thank you. Thanks for that talk, John. There are some Christians who say that, it's a secular age that we're living in, and therefore Christians shouldn't try to influence policy and laws through with their Christian convictions, because that's almost like imposing Christian ideas on a secular culture. Is there a good argument for Christians actually going into politics, going into positions of influence, and actually having an influence over our laws and policies from a Christian perspective? Is there a good argument for that, would you say?
Steve, because I have met Steve, loves history and teaches history. So I don't think he'll be surprised if I say history is the great instructor. When William Wilberforce was a young member of Parliament, I think he was 21 with Pitt the Younger when he made it into the Parliament, the two of them were both seen as future Prime Ministers. They were both brilliant, staggeringly good debaters, unbelievable capacity to mount an argument and use the English language, just incredible orators, and leave most of today's absolutely for dead. But something happened to young Wilberforce on the way. He went on a grand tour of the continent with a friend of his who was a maths teacher, apparently the most brilliant mathematician that Oxford has ever produced, and called Isaac Milner. Wilberforce was a little thin man, and Isaac Milner was a monster, and they travelled around Europe for 3 or 4 months together. And they say the buggy was over on an angle by the time they got home. It was permanently damaged. But they argued all the way around because Wilberforce said, don't take this religion seriously. And in the end, Milner persuaded him, and Wilberforce became a believer. And he retreated. Even though he's a member of Parliament, he found time to raise up his theological knowledge to a very deep level. And guess what? As a very wealthy and privileged, unfortunately and inconveniently, white male Christian, he took seriously the Galatians comment that we are now no longer free nor slave, man or woman, Gentile or Jew. We're all one in Christ. And he began the greatest human rights movement of all times, the freeing of the African slaves. It was an absolutely barbaric trade. Why did a man who was seen as a future Prime Minister rock the boat? He was cancelled, they called it being cut in those days, by the royal family as a future Prime Minister. The king walked past him at a function. He was cut. That meant that you were socially dead, you were an outcast. And social media has nothing on the way scorn was heaped on him. But people got the vibe. They understood from his careful research and his reasoned arguments that what was happening was vastly different to what the slave owners and the sugar producers told them. The women of Britain, Wilberforce's ladies, stopped buying sugar. They boycotted the product. And he fought for years and years and years, and eventually the slave trade was abolished. On his deathbed in 1833, well after Australia was established, slavery itself was abolished, and the Royal Navy was sent out to stop other countries trading in human beings, and quite a few Royal Navy officers and men lost their lives defending black people. I wonder whether Black Lives Matters will ever tell you that. He was the very model of an anti-racist. But Lord Melbourne, after whom the city is named, huffed. Politics has come to a pretty place when religion is allowed in. They wanted to silence him. Does anybody seriously suggest that William Wilberforce should have been silenced, pushed out of the public square? How could you possibly argue such a thing? So successful was the campaign that in 1975 in this country, the Australian Federal Police were approached by the New South Wales Police to say that down in Forestville there's a brothel being operated and the girls in it are slaves from Asia. And we need your help. And the Australian Federal Police said, no, there are no slaves in Australia, don't be silly. The New South Wales Police persisted that it needed federal involvement because of the fact that they'd been brought in from other countries illegally. And it turned out to be true, except they weren't 23, they were 24. And then they ran into a problem. There were no laws in this country to deal with imported slaves because we all assumed it hadn't happened. And I would say to Black Lives Matter people, well, why don't they go and have a look at modern slavery? That'd be the place to really start because, unbelievably, there's an estimated 45 million slaves today, the largest concentration of them in India.
Okay. It's been a great tour de force. Thank you, John. I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to have John here, and I think it's been so good we might get you back if you're ever in town. Yep. We've got supper on now in the cafe. We've got no more questions now. You can ask John later. We've got supper in the cafe if you want to stay. If you've got to go home, that's fine. Thank you for being patient. And John, we're just glad you got here. And John, we just thank God for you. And your answer to your question, is there a precedent or theological, here's a Christian who's been a leader in our country, and and more people should go into politics as Christians because God, it's his world. That's the basic reason. So thank you very much, and good night, and thank you for coming.